Welcome back to another Dream Diary. If you ever come across a cabin in the woods in Northwest Oregon, don't listen to the screams. To help you understand, let me take you back to where it all began. Friday morning, I was lying in bed when my dad came in to wake me. I regretted not setting an alarm earlier to give myself a chance to wake up properly. I snapped out of my daze, sat on the edge of my bed, threw on a flannel, pulled up my Carhartts, and laced up my Danners before heading downstairs for breakfast. It feels like a tradition now to come downstairs and reminded that I've been an only child for 2 years now. Today marks the anniversary of my older brother's death in a tragic car accident caused by a drunk driver. Dad quickly asked, "Hey, you all packed? Remember, it's quite a drive ahead." "Yeah, I'm ready. I just need to make one quick phone call," I replied. I called up my girlfriend to let her know that Hennessy is ready for her. Hennessy is a 115-pound, American Bulldog and English Labrador mix. He's basically all muscle. I couldn't take him with me on this trip, so I asked my girlfriend, who is a dog groomer, to watch him for a few days. Dad and I loaded our bags into the back of the Dodge and hit the road. 2 hours into the trip, we stopped at a rest area to use the bathroom. An old man in tattered clothes smirked at me. "Are you headed up the mountain?" he asked. "Yeah, just me and my dad this weekend," I replied shortly. "Be careful up there, there's evil in those woods," he warned before letting out a sinister chuckle. I quickly washed up and got out of there, feeling unsettled. I figured he was just a crazy old man, but I've never been so wrong in my life. When I met Dad back at the truck, he immediately noticed something was off. I told him it was nothing and tried to shake off my encounter with the old man. A few more hours passed, and we were deep in the woods. It was getting dark, so stopped to set up the tent and stove before starting the fire. As we sat around the fire, Dad handed me a beer. "You're 16 now, I know what kids get into these days, so all I ask is that when you drink, it's with me," he said. "Can you read my mind, old man?" I replied with a laugh. Our conversation was cut short when we both noticed something out of the corner of our eyes, but as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. We brushed it off, finished up for the night, and put out the fire before turning in. Saturday, 6 a.m., we both woke up to the sound of sticks breaking around the tent. Startled, we grabbed our handguns, thinking it might be a cougar. But as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Still on edge, we climbed out of the tent to start a fire and brew some morning coffee. After warming up with a cup, we strapped on our gear for a hike. We set off on an unmarked trail, our first mistake, if you don't count the unsettling events prior. We marked trees along the way to avoid getting lost. Suddenly, we heard faint screams coming from the northeast. Frightened, we unholstered our handguns and moved toward the sound. We stumbled upon a shack in a small clearing. As soon as we caught sight of it, the screams abruptly stopped. Without thinking, we rushed toward the shack and burst in. The stench inside was overwhelming, and we both vomited up our coffee and trail mix. As we ventured deeper into the shack, we saw an all too familiar face. The old man from before stared back at me, his grin unnaturally wide, with deep, dark pits for eyes and long, sharp, bloody teeth. He repeated his earlier warning, "There's evil in these woods." The source of the smell became clear. He stood next to a pile of rotting corpses. I barely heard my dad's yelled "run," before we bolted for the door. As we sprinted through the woods, desperately trying to find our way back to camp, we noticed unnaturally tall, slender creatures staring at us from the trees. They were jet black, almost like shadows, with no features, yet we could feel their gaze piercing us as we ran. The old man's voice taunted us, getting closer and closer, though it now sounded more gravelly, as if hundreds of the same voice were speaking at once. As we pressed on toward the truck, Dad suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest as if his lungs were giving out. He handed me the keys, telling me to keep going. Just then, one of the creatures lunged at my dad, tearing off his foot. In desperation, he drew his gun and emptied the magazine into the creature, yelling at me to run. Finally, I did, racing in the direction he had pointed. Not long after, I saw smoke from the embers of the fire we had started that morning. With a silent sigh of relief, I headed for the truck. But what I saw at camp will haunt me forever. In the fire was my dad's mangled corpse, the source of the smoke I had seen from the tree line. Horrified, I started bawling but quickly snapped out of it when the creature's voice echoed from the trees. I fumbled with the keys, jumped in the truck, and sped away. Racing down the mountain faster than I've ever driven, I could still see the shadowy figures in the trees. After a long frantic drive home, I felt like I'd made it in record time. I hurried inside, saw my girlfriend and filled her in. We couldn't stop crying about my dad. I don't know what to do. I can still hear it yelling from a distance. I'm scared, whatever it is, it's still out there, hunting. If you find a cabin in the woods in Northwest Oregon, don't listen to the screams. Never go into Black Forest. My ex and I got sober this year. Ignoring our sponsor's warnings and completely abandoning all reason and self-preservation. We, two dangerously similar people, joked that our mutual toxicity was non-existent. I had 8 months sober, and she had 10. I was doing well working construction for an independent contractor, and she as a medical assistant, though it worried me that she was working around narcotics daily. But I knew what high looked like, and she was staying straight. Still, I was the one who broke. I had kept my contempt for sobriety hidden, but not any longer. We should get out of here. I'm craving. Andy is 10 minutes away. If I stay around here, we're screwed. She agreed. We were both deep in acute withdrawal, the stage where an addict is most likely to relapse, whether due to insomnia, adversity, or simply boredom. We recognized that leaving our connections and access to drugs for a while was best. So we came up with something radical: travel to Europe in search for vampires, ghosts, or whatever else. Leah and I are inextricably drawn to one another because our personalities are nearly identical. We're both extremists. Better to burn out than fade away, kind of thing. When we used, we really used. When we fought, we really fought. Our indestructible bond of codependency usually pulls most addict couples back into the deadly fray, with even more intensity than before. Both highly interested in the paranormal, we decided to go to Germany, a country rich in folklore and supernatural mystery. And of all haunted places in Germany, none are more cursed than the Black Forest. 5 connections later, we found ourselves with a rogue nature enthusiast, a gray-haired, lean countryman named Noah whose tough, leather-like soles had walked more miles of forgotten wilderness than the lifespan of 10 suburbanites. This guy ran a little hot, $1,000 for 2 days. But 1,000 for seeing the world was less destructive than 1,000 collapsing your veins, leading to a lifetime of memories rather than desperate spiritual rubble. He promised to lead us to a mesmerizing waterfall and natural hot spring, and show us things along the way. The forest began somewhere around Heidelberg, and very quickly, we realized we were in a primitive wilderness. Firs and pines so tall that merely tilting your head up wouldn't be enough before falling backward, all packed together so tightly that the sun couldn't even pierce through the narrow cracks. It was like looking into a prism of a million mirrors, all reflecting and refracting the same deep emerald images over and over again until the end of time. Eventually, you travel so deeply into the dark abyss that front, back, and all sides look exactly the same, and it's utterly unnerving. It was noon and dusk simultaneously. I kept checking the compass. Southeast. Bordering France on one side and the majestic, castle-lined Rhine River on the other, deep in between. Noah spoke virtually the entire time about this and that. His lineage traced back to royalty, Rudolph of the 13th century, and now his grandson was merely a tour guide. How the mighty have fallen. The fragility and dubiousness of empires suddenly came into focus. So tell us about the haunted history. You know of Nosferatu? The old silent movie about Dracula? Yes. Back in the 20s, the actor who played Dracula was a recluse. He lived in these woods close to Offenburg, about 100 miles from here, and was seen many times walking the woods at night all alone. He's been dead 80 years now, and yet the last reported sighting of Max was this past January. So, Mistaken identity. I'd suppose. But he was spotted right here, right where our feet tread now, about 20 meters down that way, just beyond that one slightly crooked tree. Nobody walks this deeply without a guide, and he was reportedly alone. Noah admitted it was only a rumor. The waterfall was still 11 miles away, and the trunks only grew tighter. So narrow that all trails had disappeared, and our compass was the only pathway back to civilization. At one point, Noah stopped us and said to stay put. I immediately saw the hesitation in Lee's eyes. Stay here until I come back, he whispered. The silence and calmness as we waited was dreadful. A faint, echoing chirp sounded from far away while the trees creaked like rusty hinges on an old, wooden door. Echoing so abrasive that it sounded like we were trapped under a massive tin roof. You think it's an animal? Leah asked. I don't know. But I'm not moving unless he says so. You trust him? Led asked again. Clouds began to roll in, and the eerie stilted shadows of the towering trees began to shift and seemingly curl inward toward us like a giant's fingers. Then the sound of leaves whooshing and branches snapping rang out before the old German reappeared. You've come to see the macabre, right? Scary stuff? Well, you're about to confront it. It's bad, so if you would like, we can take another path, Noah said. No. I want to see it. Leah shouted with excitement. Noah leading the way. As soon as we rounded the bend, which wasn't really much of a bend but a blind spot, Leah shrieked, and I felt my heart skip. He was just peacefully swaying in the breeze, ankles and hands bound by rope. I became immediately dizzy and puked for the first time in 10 years, a man, hanging lifeless and blue by his neck, gently turning in concentric circles. Below him was a stone-carved statue. A 7-foot-tall bust of a genderless figure with enormous angel wings, and at its rectangular base, words inscribed in a language I've never seen. Leah immediately began to panic and shake uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around me and buried her head in my chest. She likes being scared, but not traumatized. And I think this gave her a little of both. I began bubbling with fear and anger at Noah. I thought you said we wouldn't see a person for 400 miles. What the F is this? This is literally F up. I raged at the poor old man, as is my nature. My personality dictates, and has always dictated, that I fly off the handle first and exercise reason later. Of course, he couldn't know that 10 miles in, we'd come across a suicide victim. Once my rage simmered and I began to take it in calmly, I only had one question, posed after a hasty apology: how exactly could someone hang themselves when branches of these trees don't even start until 20 feet up off the ground? Noah assured us that this was a lark and huge coincidence, before going into further detail. There's much folklore about this place, he began as we casually walked underneath the dangling corpse. Leah was clutching my arm tightly and quietly weeping. At one point, I had to halt our progress and just hold her for a second. 2 years ago, her sister hanged herself in their parents' closet. Her breakup with her boyfriend led her to move back with her parents. She started a social media trend called skin posting. Mom had been home and in the house for 3 days, wondering where Ellen ran off to. She was about to grab her coat to walk out the door for the store when she went into the closet and found her calmly turning in circles. She'd been in the same house as her dead child all that time. Since then, Leah has become very sensitive about things. Seeing something so horrific, I'm positive, induced some kind of trauma in her. And so Noah continued. The inscription on the stone is old Germanic reading, "Beware those who fly with no legs." My skin began to crawl. As the sound of crackling branches commenced above us, I felt something shifting from my peripherals up in the canopy as dread began to consume me. He went on. The further we go away from civilization, the more monuments we will come across. I asked him the meaning of those who fly with no legs, and as I did, I could sense the pulsating of my arteries as my blood pressure spiked. However, once he explained, I began to relax into a more sentient state. Germany was once called the Holy Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, there were many battles fought here. In those days, an advancement in military warfare was catapults, or trebuchets. When religious missionaries, most of whom knew nothing about technological advancement, would go on a pilgrimage through the forest, the flaming artillery would suddenly crash down upon them. And from there, they deemed them as fallen angels. It's just an old wives' tale. A pilgrimage? To where? I can only read the inscriptions as we come upon them. They're sparse, but in the scheme of this great chasm, abundant. For every 50 I've come across, there are probably 250 I haven't. Give us the gist of it, Leah finally spouted in an impatient tone. Most come from different places in time, but are all connected to one narrative, and that plot is the basis for the hauntings in this place. But from my perspective, they're simply perverted interpretations of the original meaning, which I just described. What are the perversions? My eyes were fixed just above center at whatever was making its way from tree to tree 100 feet above my head, but I was quietly paying attention to Lee's cross-examination. They say that the deeper we go, the air becomes poisoned. That the traveler then becomes disoriented and more susceptible to fever and other illnesses of the brain, leading to hallucinations. As for the flying men, there have been countless reports of walking through these woods only to look down and notice the person beside you suddenly has no legs or even eyes, and then eventually nothing below the chin. This being so shocking to the conscious mind, the person they were walking with begins to mirror the other's distorted appearance in order to cope. After that, all they remember is waking up in a hospital, barely able to recognize themselves. As I tried to simultaneously take in his words and figure out the puzzle above, the figure hovering above began to quietly giggle like a child on a swing set. A person so absolutely infantile, out of time and place, so eerie that my mind simply couldn't take it anymore. And just as suddenly as my gaze went upward, it came back down in the same instant. The large, shadowy figure, which could only be described as a leaf with hands, dropped directly in front of me. This was no mental trick, I knew what I was seeing. I shrieked "Run!" at the top of my lungs before I could even process the events. The canopy burst into an explosion of movement as the winged man left our line of sight and began chasing us at a breakneck pace. Noah took off ahead, but Leah was so paralyzed by fear that she froze for several moments, completely defenseless. I didn't wait, I grabbed her by the arm and bolted, dragging her through the labyrinthine darkness. There was no time to think or orient ourselves. I only knew we had to get out, or we'd be lost forever. And so we ran. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks that seemed to grasp at our feet like hands. Branches slashed at our faces, and the air grew colder and thicker as we plunged deeper into the forest. The shadows loomed larger, and the silence was punctuated only by the sound of our ragged breaths and the distant, mocking laughter of the creature behind us. My mind raced, searching for an escape route, but all paths led only further into the darkness. There was no way out, no end in sight. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, a never-ending maze of terror. I could feel Lee's grip weakening, her steps faltering, and I knew we were running out of time. But just as all hope seemed lost, we stumbled upon a clearing. The trees parted, revealing a small, ancient chapel, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. Without thinking, we dashed inside, slamming the heavy wooden door behind us. The creature's laughter echoed outside, but it didn't follow us in. We were safe, for the moment. Inside, the air was cold and still, the silence oppressive. The only light came from a few flickering candles on the altar, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Leah collapsed onto a pew, her chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. I joined her, my mind reeling from the events of the day. Noah was nowhere to be found. The chapel seemed to be a sanctuary of some kind, a place where the darkness couldn't reach. But it was also a tomb, filled with the weight of countless souls who had sought refuge here, only to never leave. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with the stench of decay. We were trapped, with no way out and no idea what to do next. My mind raced, searching for a plan, but all I could think about was the creature outside, waiting for us to make a move. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, our breaths the only sound in the oppressive darkness. Finally, Leah spoke, her voice trembling with fear. We have to get out of here. We can't stay here forever. But I had no answers, no solutions. All I knew was that the forest outside was filled with horrors beyond comprehension, and the creature that had chased us was still out there, waiting. We were trapped, with no way out and no hope of escape. All we could do was wait, and pray that the creature wouldn't find a way in. And so we waited, the darkness closing in around us, the fear gnawing at our minds. The chapel offered no solace, no comfort. It was a prison, a place where the dead whispered secrets and the living had no place. We were alone, lost in the darkness, with no way out and no hope of rescue. The creature's laughter echoed in the distance, a haunting reminder of the terror that awaited us outside. We were trapped, with no way out and no hope of escape. All we could do was wait, and pray that the creature wouldn't find a way in. But deep down, I knew that it was only a matter of time before it did. The darkness outside was alive, filled with horrors beyond comprehension. And we were the prey, caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The creature was out there, waiting for us to make a move, to show a sign of weakness. And when it did, it would strike, and there would be no escape. Subscribe.